In this lecture, we're going to learn about strings and Booleans. We're not limited to working with numbers in PHP. Various values can be stored in a variable. PHP has a category system for variables. Let's discuss the categories before writing code. In PHP, there's a concept called data types. A data type describes the type of data stored in a variable. Every variable will have a data type. Assigning a data type to a variable is automated by the language. We don't have to take care of this process ourselves. Despite that, it's always good to have some understanding of data types. In the previous lecture, we worked with numbers. PHP will assign the integer data type to numbers. If we're working with decimal values, the data type would be called float. The next two data types are strings and Booleans. We'll be discussing these two data types in a moment. Afterward, we have arrays and objects. These data types will have lectures of their own. The last data type is called null. A variable is null if it doesn't have a value. Here's an example of what a variable looks like without being assigned a value. It's optional to assign a value. If we decide not to assign a value, it'll be considered empty or null. You're still able to assign a value at a later time. It's not common to declare a variable without a value. However, there are some cases when you want to do this. For example, you may want to declare a variable because you'll need to use it later in your program, but don't have a value to assign it during declaration. Aside from numbers, strings are a common data type you'll be working with. Strings are the data type for raw text. We may want to store names, addresses, or paragraphs of text. If we're storing text, PHP will set the data type of a variable to string. The reason it's called string is because the text is made up of a sequence of characters that are strung together. It's a weird technical name, but you'll soon get used to it. In the editor, we're going to create a variable called name. The value of the variable will be a pair of single quotes. Strings are created by wrapping text with quotes. PHP will interpret this syntax as a string. Inside these quotes, we can write whatever we want. We can write gibberish, numbers, letters, spaces, and almost any character on your keyboard. There isn't a limit to what we can write inside these quotes. The value will be completely valid. Since the variable is called name, we should add our name. Next, we'll output the variable by typing the following: echo name. Be sure to include the semicolons. This is very important. Without a semicolon, PHP is unaware if we're finished with our line of code. Let's check out the browser for the output. Great! Our name appears in the browser. Strings are how we can store text. They're very simple to read and write. There's an alternative way to write text. Instead of using single quotes, we can wrap our text with double quotes. There isn't a difference between single quotes or double quotes. They'll both tell PHP to create a string. It's a matter of preference. I prefer to use single quotes because they're more readable. Use whichever you prefer. Let's move on to Booleans. A Boolean is a data type where the value is either true or false. I mean that quite literally. We're going to replace our code with a variable called isLoggedIn. The variable name is multi-worded. If we wanted to, we could write the entire variable name with lowercase letters. However, that can be difficult to read. One common practice is to capitalize each word except for the first word. This practice is known as camel casing. Another practice is to separate each word with an underscore. Keep in mind that underscore characters are valid in a variable name. We're going to be using camel casing for this course. It's more common than snake casing. Next, let's assign the variable to a value called true. If we type true, PHP will set the data type to a Boolean. Booleans are a way to tell our program if something is true or false. For example, we may need to tell our program if a user is logged in. A good idea would be to store this value in a variable. A variable will keep track of the current authenticated status of the user. A Boolean can only be one of two values. It can be true or false. In this example, we're setting it to true. Let's change it to false. Next, let's echo this variable. If we switch to the browser, nothing appears. It's because a false Boolean value will tell the program not to output anything. It's completely normal. If we had true, the number 1 would be outputted. PHP will not output the word true onto the screen. It'll convert the Boolean value into a number if we attempt to output it. You may be wondering, why does it matter which data type we use? Theoretically, we could stick to strings. However, it's essential to stick with the appropriate data type whenever possible. PHP will attempt to optimize our program based on the data types of our variables. For example, Booleans can only be one of two values. PHP never has to worry about a third value. Therefore, it'll be able to process our code much faster as opposed to a string. In addition, PHP can behave weirdly if we mix our data types. Throughout this course, we will get a lot of practice with different data types. You'll see how each data type can come in handy. We'll continue our studies in the next lecture.